The title of my talk today is Monster as Metaphor, Family as Movement, South Korea-U.S. Relations in the Host. And I'd like us to think about three things in particular. How the film, The Host, mediates news events through fantasy, how the monster and the family act as metaphors for South Korea-U.S. relations, and how the film ultimately reappropriates the meaning of South Korea in global discourse. In the official vernacular spoken by titled experts, South Korea, once poor and primitive, now rich and victorious, models a third world country's teleological ascent. Speaking at the G8 conference in 2009, U.S. President Barack Obama painted such a picture. He said, "When my father traveled to the United States from Kenya to study, at that time the per capita income and gross domestic product of Kenya was higher than South Korea's. Today, obviously, South Korea is a highly developed and relatively wealthy country, and Kenya is still struggling with deep poverty in much of the country." Likewise, in his book, In Defense of Global Capitalism, Swedish scholar Johan Norberg contrasts South Korea with another African country, Zambia. Although on equal footing in 1960, South Korea has surpassed Zambia's wealth by 20-fold in 2000, writes Norberg. These comparisons say, in effect, that South Korea has made it in the global capitalist arena. They say other third world countries could follow suit if they took individual responsibility for their performance in the global marketplace, instead of blaming the system's inherent inequalities. But while these accounts romanticize South Korea's hypermodernity and take other countries to task for their underdevelopment, they cover over South Korea's continued poverty. They minimize South Korea's growing class polarization, the social suffering inherent to unemployment and insecure employment, and the fragmentation of families. They underestimate the ongoing historical trauma of the unresolved Korean War. Nevertheless, in contrast to this official rhetoric, there exists a more critical voice marked by an interest in class struggle. South Korean auteur cinema has emerged in part as a form of sometimes veiled political expression against national and transnational authoritarianism. Auteurs working in the new millennium, such as Bong Joon-ho and Lee Chang-dong, often stage dramatic confrontations within economic and historical modernity to dissent from official discourses. Their films challenge their nation's new identity and ideological function as a showcase of US-style modernization. This sensitivity to power relations is rooted in the populist Minjung movement of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, established during ruthlessly restrictive military dictatorships that we just heard about. The movement's film culture reveled in taboo Marxism and saw film as a political weapon. Minjung-inspired filmmakers represented South Korean history as a narrative of struggle forged through foreign oppression and people's resistance, not a storied example of capitalism. This tradition is still with us. A number of South Korean filmmakers show that although capitalism has led to greater wealth, it has also spawned new disparities and insecurities. Such representation emphasizes and empathizes with the marginalized, the landless urban poor and lower paid and insecure sectors of labor. Notably, the historical context of current South Korean cinema is one of economic downturn. The 1997 Asian financial crisis is often considered to be the second worst calamity in South Korean history, right after the Korean War. Thus, critical imagery may bring relief, pleasure, and points of identification to spectators who have felt victimized by the capitalist world system, yet have had to hide their opposition in order to conform to their social environment. And I think perhaps most emblematic of this trend is the socially conscientious blockbuster The Host, outstanding for its critical accolades and box office performance. In the film, a mutated monster born of a US military lab unexpectedly turns up years later, killing unsuspecting visitors who have gathered at the Han River. Running for their lives, the film's main protagonist, Kang-doo, accidentally drops his 13-year-old daughter Hyunso's hand. The monster's capture of the daughter begins a struggle that pits the girl's family against the monster and the state's unhelpful authorities. If officials on the global stage reduce recent South Korean history to peaceful development, the host doubly subverts this figuration by rendering history as South Korean kowtow to the U.S. through a monstrous mutation. Working people's struggle against indifferent and even brutal authorities. The title of the host is also very interesting to think about because it makes us think about not only the biological, the monster in the host is considered a biological carrier of a virus, but the term host also makes us think about the viral spread of risk at large. The planet is now wired through unprecedented new technologies that have decentralized international transactions. Challenges like climate change, attaining energy and food security, financial crisis, terrorism, cyber attacks, and drug and human trafficking are mobile and synchronous, networked and untraceable. Whatever crisis is ailing one corner of the world is sure to spread everywhere. In turn, these sprawled and viral new enemies can serve as pretext to incite a panic mentality. Governments can induce mass mobilization of whatever means necessary, from militarism to surveillance, to eradicate so-called evil. In this respect, the exaggerated scenarios of viral pandemic and radical containment in the host evoke the planetary state of emergency since the 9/11 attacks. Moreover, the term host also suggests, by coincidence, the film's concern with South Korea's hosting of U.S. armies since the mid-century. Bearing witness to the cumulative effect of America's foreign policy on the rest of the world, the film attempts to bring a measure of relief. It concentrates the forces of viral panic, capitalist gluttony, and veiled militarism into a monster who can be targeted and destroyed, not by official channels, but by the reinvention of family. So this is the second part, and here I'm going to go into the film analysis. My film analysis begins by turning to the film's opening, a kind of genesis event. The scene follows a basic Hollywood formula. Horror occurs when, as Robin Wood famously said, normality is threatened by the monster. This opening scene clarifies a relationship of casual servitude that is suggestive of the historical past and the immediate present. The encounter between a native South Korean and an imperial American is redolent with banality and domination. Borrowing from the Frankenstein horror tradition, the scene stages the isolated laboratory of the mad scientist in blue scrubs. The older white American commands a younger Korean man to do something unethical and illegal. Pour formaldehyde down the drain, despite the younger man's hesitation. As in the Frankenstein tradition, the host mad scientist is what Andrew Tudor calls the primary disordering impulse due to his moral feeling. So let's take a look. Whoops, I'm sorry. Let's take a look at the scene.
The concentrated race and the medication stays fast, pour it right down the drain. If I pour them in the drain, they're running stuff on river. That's right. Let's just dump them in the Han River. But you know, this is not just any toxic chemical, so the Han River is very broad, Mr. Chairman. Let's try the broad-minded about this. Anyway, that's pouring. So, start pouring.
While outrageous, the scene is also feels prosaic and unremarkable. That this scene reanimates an actual historical episode further emphasizes the paradoxical interplay between fantasy and lived social relations. In 2000, Albert McFarland, the sub-director of the U.S. 8th Army Mortuary Building, ordered a Korean soldier to dump 20 boxes of formaldehyde and methanol down the drain. Koreans demanded the U.S. military fire McFarland, but nothing happened. He kept his job. In 2002, another U.S. military incident outraged South Korea. 2 uniformed U.S. Army soldiers drove a tank that crushed to death 2 female junior high school students. Despite vehement street protests, the soldiers never faced a Korean court and were acquitted of negligent homicide by the U.S. military court. Due to the constraints placed by U.S. military extraterritoriality, American personnel are immune to Korean law and cannot be prosecuted accordingly. Even if audiences did not know Bong had adapted an actual incident, this laboratory scene is eerily believable, given the global sprawl of America's military complex and its power over the rest of the world. A reverse scenario of a Korean man bullying a white American man would alternatively achieve a dream effect. Second, this opening elicits the familiar antics of the mad scientist, whose arrogant experiments disturb the natural order and lead to unnatural ramifications. Consequently, the simultaneity of the real and the unreal concentrates the genre's conventional horror and the horror of South Korea's continued powerlessness, even in its own country. Unwittingly but inevitably, the formaldehyde changes the Han River's ecology to birth a mutant creature. Rather than a gargantuan like Godzilla, the creature is sized to a more human scale, which makes the monster more plausible. By situating the creature in our growing sensitivity to mutated wildlife under global warming, the film flirts with the outlandish yet credible notion that such a mutant could exist undiscovered and transit between scientific possibility and horror's implausibility. When the gray, fish-like creature makes its debut at the park, it is defined by its physical prowess. The creature's enormous mouth opens vertically and horizontally like a hexagon to suggest the creature is driven entirely by its appetite. During its rampage, the creature swallows unsuspecting people whole. The creature's relentless forward motion mows down the crowd. The image harkbacks to the incident of the girls killed by the U.S. military tank. Moreover, the running crowd scene of refuge seekers harks back to the Korean War. At the same time, the backdrop of this chase sequence moves from scenes of grassy nature to cars and skyscrapers. The social context of this horror film is not the psychoanalytic dynamic of the nuclear family often seen in American horror films, but the larger framework of South Korean city life and its dynamic of geopolitical domination. Instead of a documentarian-style rendering that might contain the anxiety of lived trauma by its realistic effect, the host amplifies the threat of the real by placing a fantastical or outrageous charge onto its mediation of historical events.